Since Howard Zinn, like Hobbes and Kant and John Stuart Mill, had a rather interesting life, I'll quickly offer some facts about his life before also offering a little bit about Martin Luther King, focusing on that which you might not know. So Howard Zinn lived from 1922 to 2010. He was raised by poor working class parents in Brooklyn, New York. When World War II came, he enlisted in the Air Force as a bombardier. He became a decorated bombardier. He enlisted because he had a strong anti-fascist impulse. He thought fascism was deeply wrong, and he thought it was important to stop it. After World War II, he attended NYU using the GI Bill to pay for his tuition, and then got a PhD at Columbia. From 1956 to 1963, he was a professor at Spelman College, which was an all-black women's college in Atlanta, Georgia. While there, he played a significant role in the civil rights movement. In addition to advising Spelman's students, many of whom became prominent civil rights activists, Zinn became an advisor for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he was central in many other respects. Eventually, he was fired from Spelman in 1963, largely for his work on the civil rights movement, that is, largely for supporting students in their, for example, sit-ins, and he moved to Boston University. In the mid-1960s, before the anti-Vietnam War movement was robust, Zinn made a very influential public case against the war. He called it The Logic of Withdrawal, and it was published in the New York Times. It argued, for the first time in serious intellectual culture, that not only was the war a mistake, but it was fundamentally immoral. That is, the standard anti-war view at the time, and again, the anti-war movement wasn't a large movement at the time, but among those who publicly objected to the war, they typically said it was an unfortunate mistake. It was a misguided calculation. Zinn argued that it was fundamentally immoral for the United States to invade another country, so he took a very different stance. In 1968, Zinn became one of two people to travel to Vietnam to receive the first POWs released by the North Vietnamese. He was also one of two people to edit and annotate a copy of the Pentagon Papers that was read into the Congressional Record. If you don't know what the Pentagon Papers were, Daniel Ellsberg was he had fought in Vietnam, and he was an employee of the Rand Corporation, which is kind of a broadly conservative think tank. And he was tasked with creating a history of the Vietnam War, how we got in, why we got in, what we did, why we stayed in, and so on. And he and others created this history, and in doing so, Ellsberg came to the conclusion that the war was entirely unjust, and that the case that Zinn had made was in fact correct. He, of course, was the report had been commissioned by the government and was not to be made public. Well, Zinn snuck a copy out of the office, photocopied it, and eventually was able to get it read into the Congressional Record. He was arrested for this and prosecuted. During the time after he had stolen the papers, when people knew they were stolen, but they had not yet been read into the Congressional Record, Zinn was hiding Ellsberg in his house. Zinn also hid another Vietnam War protester named Father Daniel Berrigan, who had burned draft cards, among other things. He's kind of you can think of it kind of like a Forrest Gumpy life, where he's at key places at key moments and plays some role in these key moments. You've hopefully all heard of Martin Luther King Jr. He lived from 1929 to 1968. He lived a rather remarkable life. He was a really excellent, he's known as a civil rights activist, but he was also a really excellent moral and political philosopher. You've probably heard primarily about his early life, his role in, for example, supporting bus boycotts. But it's important that you understand a bit about his later life, too. So late in life, he was sharply criticized by most of the mainstream press, including venues that had supported his earlier efforts. So we're not talking about the Southern mainstream press, we're talking about papers like the New York Times. He's also sharply criticized by the political establishment of both parties. So it's not just Southern Democrats and some Republicans who are critical of King at this point. It's nearly all elected officials. And he's in fact largely abandoned by the mainstream civil rights activists. Well, why is that? Here are some things that Zinn said towards the end of his life. He said the US government is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. And he had in mind Vietnam and other US interventions abroad. He said the evils of capitalism are as real as the evils of militarism and the evils of racism. Here's a longer quote. He says, we must recognize that we can't solve our problem now until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power. This means a revolution of values and other things. We must see now that the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are all tied together. You can't really get rid of one of these without getting rid of the others. The whole structure of American life must be changed. America is a hypocritical nation, and we must put our own house in order. So here he's claiming that if you object to racism and you think racism is a bad thing, and you think that segregation in the South is a bad thing, then you should also object to economic inequality, and you should also object to US military intervention abroad. Well, that's a pretty powerful statement, and many people who did object to racism didn't like the implication that they were being inconsistent, that the evils of economic exploitation and militarism were on a par with the evils of racism. In fact, many people thought that economic exploitation was non-existent in the United States and that US militarism was only for the good, whereas they thought racism was bad. So they thought King had sort of lost his way, that he was misguided and no longer worth taking seriously. Okay, so that's Martin Luther King Jr. Of course, at the time that he wrote Letter from Birmingham Jail, which is your reading for this week, one of the readings for this week, he hadn't said any of this yet. Okay, so we're going to stop the introductory segment in a moment and then start with the real content next time. I just want to remind you that for the quizzes for this unit, not everything that we cover will be covered in the slideshow. That is, not everything that the quiz covers will be covered in the slideshow, so you'll have to do the readings to find some of the information that's covered on the quiz. Okay, so I'm going to stop the introductory segment there, and we'll start next time by looking at Hobbes' view of law versus justice and using Zinn and King to think about whether Hobbes' view is plausible.